in an island 90 miles away from the coast of Florida. The people of Cuba have been under an oppressive regime under Castro that has kept them in a cycle of poverty and oppression for the past decades. Miami has become their safe haven. Good morning. My name is Sabrina Lopez. And to analyze the extent of Cuban influence, we must ask ourselves, to what extent has Cuban immigration shaped communities in Miami over the past 50 years? With my findings, one can claim that Cuban immigration has had a major positive influence on Miami's economy and culture over the span of the last 50 years. In the broader context, we must understand why some Cuban immigrants would want to come to Miami. In an age of scandals and political debates regarding Hispanic immigration, some fail to be empathetic with the situation that Cubans might be facing at home. So this is life in Cuba without any falsified statistics. There might be some sources such as Quartz magazine that publish articles like these and graphs showing how under Castro, the Cuban healthcare system thrived. For example, showing the physicians per capita increasing and the infant mortality rate decreasing. We can debunk the infant mortality rate simply by an article for National Institution of Medicine in Chile that proved that the Cuban government actually encourages abortion when the mother has an abnormal prenatal diagnosis. And that is the reason for the lower mortality rates. And for the physician per thousands of people, what is the point of that if they are underpaid and hospitals often look like this, according to therealcuba.com? One has to bring their own bed sheets, light bulbs, and supplies to even get by in a hospital like this. And in agricultural terms, it's even worse. This is a line in a YouTube video of Cubans waiting for a piece of bread because of the flour shortage. And this was confirmed in a TripAdvisor thread where a tourist went recently in January 2019 and confirmed that in the streets of Havana, people have been waiting for a piece of bread or even some chicken at the market. In the Urban Transformation of the Developing World, article provided by College Board, there are 4 conditions in which a developing country will grow in a positive way. One of them being globalization, which binds international cities together, which Cuba does not perform because it is very politically and trade isolated, and the decentralization of government in poor countries. As we know, Cuba is a communist country and it is not decentralized. In fact, everything is centralized. So when there is no movement forward, the migration waves began. The 2 most significant being the freedom flights, which brought an influx of blue-collar workers and diversified Miami in the 60s and 70s, and the mayoral exodus. This was highly stigmatized by the media because Castro had named these immigrants the post-revolutionary scum of Cuba, and that reflected the treatment they got once they got into Miami. In an article found by the Miami Herald, the study concluded that in the 80s, during the mayoral exodus, Cubans were the second least wanted group of neighbors after religious cult members, even though only 2% of them had actually committed crimes in Miami. When they did settle, they settled in Hialeah and Little Havana. We can see traces of Cuban culture even in American literary pieces, such as Looking for the Gulf Motel, where the son is of a Cuban immigrant descent, and he says that his mother carried with her 2 dozen loaves of Cuban bread, brown bags bulging with enough mangoes to last the entire week, our espresso pot, the pressure cooker, and a pork roast reeking garlic throughout the entire lobby. These are classic Cuban dishes that can be seen especially in Little Havana, which is a major tourism hotspot. It hosts iconic landmarks such as Versailles, a famous Cuban restaurant which hosts a lot of politicians, and Domino Park. All of these are clustered around Calle Ocho and bring over 200 tourists a day, according to Havana Journal. These 200 tourists often stop for a Cuban sandwich, an espresso, or even a souvenir, and this stimulates the economy and brings in a money influx. Not only does it bring in tourism, it also has an underlying chain migration effect. When a Cuban in Cuba sees that there is a Cuban enclave waiting for them in Miami where they can find familiarity with the language and culture, low rent compared to other neighborhoods in Miami, and a place where they can find employment, it makes a migration effect because they would want to come to Little Havana. The only downfall to this is that other ethnic groups such as Colombians and Venezuelans might have a hard time finding employment because business owners in Hialeah and Little Havana want to keep the authenticity and Cubanness that comes with the money influx. Even despite this, Cuban prominence in Miami has led to the immigration of over 100,000 Latin groups, and they have established 25% of Miami businesses, according to BBC News. This is another stimulator of the economy. If culture and economy was not enough, Cubans have had political action in Miami since they were exiles in the 60s. In 2016, more than half of Cubans' residents voted for Trump in Florida. According to The Guardian, Cuban immigrants have the power to push the state to the left. Even despite more than half of them voting for Trump, there was the biggest margin that Republicans have ever seen, and they lost to a Democrat since decades. This is because the new generations of Cuban are straying away from their ancestors and their exiled parents and going to more liberal side. This is because they are seeking a thaw with the embargo with Cuba, and this is more on a liberal ideal. Based on this information, we can conclude that Cuban immigration into Miami over the past 50 years has been positive and highly influential for Miami's diversified culture, economy, and political activism. Some of the limitations that might come with this is that Cubans might not be the only ones responsible for this stimulation, since there has been a slow trickle of other ethnic backgrounds come in, such as Americans, Venezuelans, Puerto Ricans. And there's increase in government spending because since a lot of these Cubans are new immigrants, they require more welfare and low-income funding. That leads to an increase of government spending. Thank you. What are your questions?
Thank you, Sabrina. I have two questions for you. First up, what information did you need before you began your research, and how did that information shape your research?
Some of the information that I needed before shaping my research was the different ways that Cubans have affected Miami. So it wasn't just a cultural thing that I was looking for. I was also looking for how it stimulated the economy and what kind of political push they brought to Southern Florida.
Thank you. And last question, what additional questions emerged as you were going through the research?
Some of the additional questions that emerged were the types of businesses that were emerging in Little Havana that weren't only restaurants but also places such as Domino Park, which also brings tourists because it is a classic tradition in Cuba. And that is a major source of money influx. It's not just restaurants that you can find anywhere, but also small trades that you would find in Havana and the streets of Cuba.
You are done.